Thanks very much for coming today. It's a pleasure to introduce this second program in a series brought to you by the Franke Program in Science and Humanities here at Yale and hosted by the Whitney Humanities Center. We had a marvelous event yesterday with a screening of The Botany of Desire and a panel discussion, and today we're going to go a little more intimate and focusing on Michael Pollan's current and future work, including a book to come out entitled Cooked, which now I guess we can say the title of. I already had the pleasure well, I'll start with Jack, our interlocutor today. Jack Hitt is a New Haven resident and local journalist. He was educated on the streets and alleys of Charleston, South Carolina, and is now, although a loyal son of the South, he's still here in New England for quite a number of years. Jack is a journalist, author, and now stage performer. He has written for the New Yorker magazine, New York Times magazine, Harper's, and Gardens and Guns, and many other prestigious organizations. He's the recipient of a Peabody Award and is, I know, a great conversationalist. So that's his role today. He will be discussing or be leading or helping in the conversation here with our guest from out of town, former Nutmegger and Cornwall, Connecticut resident, Michael Pollan. I had the pleasure to introduce Michael yesterday, so I'll keep it short. Today, the author of 6 books, including Second Nature, Botany of Desire, In Defense of Food, and the author of the upcoming book to be released next month, Cooked. Michael is well known for his work now on, has grown from being a gardening writer to a broader field, a writer of food, agricultural policy, and our interaction with the environment through agriculture and food. And without further ado, please welcome our 2 guests. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Rick.
How long are we doing this? How long are we doing this? Okay. Do we want to do questions and answers, though? Okay. Good. Well, welcome to New Haven, Connecticut, Michael.
Thank you, Jack. Good to be here.
And as you know, I'm a professional journalist, so let me start with my ambush question. Now, I know you're a Game of Thrones freak and probably seen a few episodes of Girls, but here's my question.
1 episode of Girls, 0 of Game of Thrones.
What's your Food Channel guilty pleasure? What does Michael Pollan watch on television?
About food?
Yeah.
You know, I've watched a few episodes of Top Chef, and I used to like The Iron Chef when it first came on. I found that kind of entertaining. But I don't know if it's a guilty pleasure. It's sort of more of a professional obligation to stay up on what's going on. I mean, I am fascinated by the phenomenon of cooking on television, which I think is a really weird and interesting thing going on. I mean, you have millions of Americans who spend more time watching people cook on TV than actually cook themselves. Which is weird when you think about it, because at the end of that half hour, you don't get anything to eat. And in this book, I spent a little time trying to unpack what mystery would be.
You know, in the old days, when the cook would go on television, like the Today Show, they'd always have that little note at the bottom, it's like, for the recipe, you know, right off to, the Today Show and get the recipe. But none of these shows end with a recipe.
No, not the ones in prime time. I mean, the ones in the evening. The ones during the day, you can still get some how-to. You can learn how to, make a frittata or something. But at night, it's game show, it's spectacle, it's fire and
right. So what's your why are we doing that? What's going on in us?
Well, I thought about this because there's lots of other things in our lives that we've outsourced without looking back. Sewing your clothing, changing the oil in your car. There are no TV shows about these things. Cooking is different. And what I think it is I actually think we're nostalgic for the experience, which we all had as kids, or most of us had as kids, or at least in our generation and before, of watching our moms usually cook. and being in the kitchen and these amazing smells and this rising anticipation and all this alchemy, that happens in the kitchen. It was really fun to be a part of that, and we don't get that anymore. So, and I think there's something really primal about cooking. I mean, these are the transformations of nature into culture that really made us who we are.
So you're saying it's not that we miss the cooking, it's that we miss watching the cooking.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that there are two experiences. There's cooking, and there's definitely watching cooking, which is something that a lot of us have grown up doing. And it was really central to our sense of our parents and the sensory experience of being in your home. If you think back to your childhood, and you can imagine, you have memories of playing outside and doing things, but there's so much sensory satisfaction that happened in the kitchen.
Right. And all that bonding and all that sort of community that happened in there. So we miss that.
And that special kind of conversation that happens when people are doing stuff, not just talking to each other.
Right.
It's a very natural form of conversation. I think it's, you have teenage kids, that the best time to talk to them is while you're doing something together rather than having a conversation. You might be driving, or you might be chopping onions, or working in the garden. But that's the easiest way of having those conversations.
So many of these guys on the shows are men.
Yeah.
Right. And here we are, two guys talking about cooking.
Right.
And not fancy cooking, chopping onions cooking. Right.
Yeah.
So, has Betty Friedan's dream come true?
Well, no. I wouldn't say it has. I mean, the professional cook has been male for a long time. Mm-hmm. Even while women were stuck with all the work of cooking for, since for a very long time. There was this other thing, getting paid to cook.
Right.
Men often got to do that. I do think there is some evidence, and there's some research to suggest it, that men are cooking more, and that we just
don't wash the clothes.
That's right. We
Yeah,
don't.
right.
We definitely don't
We don't
wash
wash the clothes. Right.
But we cook, and in greater numbers, and we're raising children, I think, today, who actually don't. And this isn't true across the society, but certainly my son, and I'll bet your daughters, don't think of cooking as a female,
Right.
job. They see male cooks in the culture being celebrated, who are, often incredibly macho and very important characters in the culture. And so I think there is an opportunity in this to build a culture of cooking that wouldn't be as kind of isolated female work.
So what you're saying, so men are now in the kitchen in service to Betty Friedan's
Well, they're actually
dream.
often in front of the grill outside.
Often there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but they were always there.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, but even the numbers of that, women are insisting that their husbands cook more,
Right.
and husbands are comfortable cooking on the grill.
Right.
And women have also pretended they didn't know how this was done for a very long time. They treat grilling as this mystery that they couldn't possibly master, and would you please, take this outside and grill it? And I learned recently is a subterfuge.
Right.
It's not that hard. They know how to do it. Judith grills when I'm away.
But there are other men in the kitchen besides husbands, right?
Yeah.
Who else is in the kitchen?
Well, sons.
Well, I'm thinking of corporations.
Oh yeah. Well,
Those men.
Yeah, they're in the pantry. Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, those are the men that we don't think about,
Right.
Who are cooking, and they're it's Steve Sanger, the president of General Mills, and whoever is the president of Pillsbury. And that's one of the ironies. I mean, we've outsourced cooking to corporations to a very large extent. To give you some sense of the magnitude, I mean, the average American spends 27 minutes a day cooking now, which has fallen steadily since the 60s. And and male cooking's gone up a little bit, but basically 57% of meals today are cooked. home cooked. But the definition has had to be really loosened.
Oh, that was what I was going to ask you. So what does
Yeah.
it mean to cook a meal?
It means,
according to General Mills.
Right. A home cooked meal is one that involves some assembly of ingredients. So in other words, merely
Peel off the aluminum foil.
No, it's got a little further than that. Nuking a pizza is not cooking. However, pouring bottled salad dressing over pre-washed lettuce or assembling a sandwich is cooking, scratch cooking. Even if you got the meat from the deli and the mayonnaise and and bought the roll. So we've definitely defined cooking downward for the purposes of marketing. And and corporations are doing most of the cooking.
Do you have any numbers on like real cooking? Like let's still go back to scratch cooking.
I asked.
Grandma cooking.
There's this in the book. I interviewed this marketing expert, this wonderful crusty guy named Harry Balzer, who's been tracking America.
I'm sorry. What is his name?
Harry Balzer. Oh, don't go for the.
Okay,
cheap
I
God.
was doing my best deadpan there. I was just,
I thought we were at Yale, and you wouldn't make jokes like that. Anyway, he's been tracking American consumer
That's not a Bart Simpson joke. Are you sure? Okay, keep going. Yeah.
He's been tracking cooking habits for a very long time, and he's really cynical at this point. And he'll tell you that most Americans are cheap and lazy, and that's why they don't cook. And he's. What was the question exactly?
Well, I wanted to know if there was any real numbers about.
Oh yeah, real
cooking.
What we would call scratch cooking.
What we would call not sandwich
He
making.
said the numbers are too low to measure.
Really?
Yeah. He doesn't even ask questions.
Now, do we have a sense of how precipitous that decline was? Like, what was it, in 1965 or something? Do we have any sense of that?
Home cooked meals. Well, first they defined them a little more tightly,
Right.
and they were 60, 70% of meals were home cooked.
Are we talking 30 years ago? Or
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
The 60s is where the decline really began.
Right.
But it's important to understand when we talk about this decline that we think of it as a consumer-driven phenomenon, and that women were going back to work, and there was less time. All of which is true, but there is another narrative, and this was kind of surprising to me, that corporations had been trying to worm their way into the kitchen for much longer, and long before women went to work,
Right.
trying to convince us to eat processed foods. And it really takes place after World War II. You had all these technologies that were invented for the war effort. How to make milk survive for months on end, and field rations basically. And how could we take this brilliant technology of field rations and get people to actually eat it?
Wait a minute. Are you saying there's a line from field rations to the Swanson's pot pie?
Yeah, and to Hamburger Helper and to Tang and all these kind of things. And so a lot of effort had gone into developing this shelf-stable, acceptable, pseudo food for the war effort. And as in so many other things, there was this effort to convert those technologies to peacetime uses. And the industry pushed really hard to then get women to buy these products. And women rejected them en masse. They just didn't feel that this was cooking. So when you got a cake mix, for example, they could not get people to use these cake mixes, which were essentially just add water. And they did this marketing research, and they found that women felt that that was not cooking. They couldn't take credit for a cake that was made from a mix. And then they figured out, they did a little more market research, and they figured out if you didn't use a powdered egg, which they were using, and actually asked the cook to crack open an egg, that would do it. And then you could take credit. And it was actually when they stopped including the powdered eggs and put in the cracked eggs, which happens in the late 50s, that they could sell cake mixes. And yeah, so they've been, but it's a project, and it's a supply-driven project. And there was a lot of resistance because it was felt that part of your obligation as a parent was to cook for your kids. You didn't let other people do it.
So there's this line where we feel like we no longer are cooking. And I take it that General Mills and these other companies have done great work in sort of circumscribing the outlines of that border, right?
They have. I mean, it's been a very sustained effort and very sophisticated. And many of the products are designed to give you something to do, even though they could be designed to give you nothing to do.
Right.
But it also, I think the key breakthrough was, you mentioned Betty Friedan earlier, and she is a key figure because she was, raising the specter of renegotiating the relationships between men and women around chores and child rearing. And she was saying that this was unjust and it needed to be changed. And she was asking for a very uncomfortable conversation around kitchen tables all over America. And it happened. And we've all been party to those uncomfortable conversations over who's going to do what, especially when both members of the household are working. And the industry saw this as a great opportunity. Whatever you're going to do with, the cleaning and the clothes and the child care, we can take care of the cooking. And the industry actually adopted feminist rhetoric beginning in the 70s. And so there was a famous campaign that Kentucky Fried Chicken had where it was on billboards all across America in the 70s, and it was a bucket of fried chicken, and over it was a very simple headline, 2 words, women's liberation.
Wow.
And, everybody was happy to have that conversation diffused. And the industry said, hey, we got you covered. Don't argue anymore. And that was a real breakthrough for industrial cooking.
So since real scratch cooking is now this almost unmeasurable number, according to your consultant,
I don't think it's quite as bad as he says, but remember, he's part of the food industry.
Right.
And he wants to minimize this as a realistic option.
Right. So, I was looking through I was looking at your other books, and there's a nice sort of arc or a narrative arc here, right? Botany of Desire looks at our interaction with the food when it's in the ground, right? When it's when we're all co-evolving, right? And then Omnivore's Dilemma sort of looks at it when it's on the plate, right? So in a sense, is this book trying to examine this non-existent space in between?
Yeah, it's funny. I was surprised to end up working on this book because I had been looking at the food chain. I've been writing about the food chain for about 12 years. I did a piece on genetically modified food that ended up in Botany of Desire. And Omnivore's Dilemma was sort of on the plate, but a lot of it was about agriculture and farming. And I looked at conventional industrial corn farming and organic farming and local farming. And so that was the beginning of the food chain.
Right.
And I found that really interesting. Where does your food come from? And then I wrote 2 books about health and nutrition. I wrote In Defense of Food, what happens to the food after you eat it? And what does it do to your body? And why are we so struggling with chronic disease and obesity? And but then I realized there was this missing middle link, which is the food coming out of the ground. How does it get transformed into meals? And it turned out that those transformations, and I didn't appreciate this going in, had a tremendous bearing both on the farm, looking back to the beginning of the food chain, and on our health. And let me explain how. Whether you cook or not has an enormous effect on what kind of agriculture we have. To the extent we're letting corporations cook for us, they are going to support huge farms producing monocultures. Big deals with big. General Mills is not going to be able to buy from a small local farm. They don't know how to go about it. They don't want to have that many contracts.
Right.
They want 1 carrot producer. They don't want 100 carrot producers. Walmart is sort of trying a little bit to regionalize their sourcing, and they're finding it's very difficult. They don't know how to do it. So if we are interested in rebuilding a more regional or local food system, I think it's going to top out pretty soon if people aren't willing to cook. I just don't think you can have, if all the cooking is being done by corporations and industry, all the farming will be done by comparably scaled institutions with all the problems that, and it's not just that bigness is bad, but bigness tends to move toward monoculture, and that's the original sin of I think, American agriculture. And then on the other side, there's all this fascinating research that suggests that when you outsource your cooking, you put on a lot of weight. The way corporations cook differently than humans do. They use lots of salt, fat, and sugar. Why? Well, because they like to use the cheapest possible raw ingredients and dress them up and make them palatable. And those are the three, primary colors of the food industry: salt, fat, and sugar. They also use lots of novel chemicals to keep the food looking fresher than it really is. Because if you're making that pot pie, you need a lot of emulsifiers to keep the oils and the water-based parts from separating and looking really nasty. So they use a lot of chemicals that individuals don't have in their pantry. And so people, as it turns out, and I was kind of surprised to learn this, the most important thing about your diet is not any particular nutrients, good or bad, that are in it or out of it, or any particular foods. It's the activity of was it cooked by human beings. And some of us can afford to have very well-paid human beings cook for us and go out to really nice restaurants that do source well. But for most people, a healthy diet will depend on a human being cooking it, presumably somebody you're living with, or you. And we know that people who eat home-cooked food have lower weight, much healthier in various ways, and not to mention their family lives are healthier in the psychological sense.
We all grow up learning that we eat 3 meals a day. It's what we were told, right? It's what we say all the time.
Yeah.
We eat 3 meals a day. What's the reality?
The reality today is there's something called secondary eating, which the Department of Agriculture has begun to measure. And secondary eating is eating while you're doing other things. If we were eating now, we're doing some secondary drinking. And this has taken off dramatically. And we now spend 78 minutes a day engaged in secondary eating. This is while watching television. This is while driving. And we spend less time eating meals. And I don't know what the number is for meals. It's in the 50 minutes or something like that. So we spend more time in secondary eating than primary eating, which is what we used to call meals. The problem is that secondary eating tends to be highly processed foods. It's snack foods. And if you look at the growth in calories over the last 30 years, the obesity epidemic is usually dated to 1980. So what are we eating more of? Well, it's food produced, it's processed food. It's the calories of refined flour and refined corn and soy, basically. And it's secondary eating. So as meals have gone down, secondary eating has gone up. And on balance, we're eating almost another, in terms of calories, almost another whole meal a day. So actually, it's not 3 a day, it's almost 4 a day when you crunch all that secondary eating in there.
So if we were to construct a graph that had like obesity rates on the bottom and cup holders in minivans along the left side, that would just be one of these lines that went like that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I don't know why we don't have microwaves in the glove compartment yet, but it's coming. Mark my words.
So for this book, you decided to go back into the kitchen and explore this Terra Incognita that we abandoned some 30 years ago.
Yeah, it was the part of the food chain I thought I knew best. Because I cook. I've always liked to cook. Not that ambitiously, not with great skill, but that's what we did. And I thought, as a journalist, you usually want to go out and learn about stuff you don't know anything about, the real Terra Incognita. But it turned out that, this area, this link in the food chain that I thought was hidden in plain sight was a lot more interesting and complicated than I realized.
Right, so you got these phyla of cooking, right? So there's like fire and roasting outdoors, and there's like water and cooking on a stovetop, and there's air, and you discuss cooking bread. And then there's your fourth phylum, fermentation.
Earth.
Right, earth.
Yeah.
And your big topic there is sauerkraut,
right.
One of them. Right. So is that really a fourth phylum, or did you feel like you had to add one more, chapter? I mean, sauerkraut,
no.
Really? Sauerkraut compared to bread? So tell what is it? I mean, what is fermentation? Why is that like a fourth order of
right? Well, the book is divided into these 4 parts, each of which correspond to one of the classical elements. So it starts with fire, which is the most basic, primitive, oldest kind of cooking, putting meat on a flame, which may go back as much as 2 million years. So before we were even Homo sapiens, Homo erectus knew how to do this, and it conferred huge advantages on that species. And then water is cooking with pots, everyday home cooking, any kind of liquid, stews, soups, braises, and combining things in pots, which happens much later. It's like we've only had pottery for about 10,000 years. So it kind of rises with the birth of agriculture, and that makes sense because you have all these grains that you need to soften, and water and things like that. Air is baking, bread, and the history of, the West is very tied up with the history of bread. And earth is, I would argue it might be the most important. Not just sauerkraut, that's, the synecdoche of all of fermented food, but is the one I tried first. And earth, I call it earth because the processes of cooking with microbes is similar to what goes on in the earth, and some of the microbes come from the earth. It's basically microbial cooking without heat. And that's been a very important part of human history. Before refrigeration...
So we're talking about like pickling,
I'm talking about pickling vegetables,
right.
I'm talking about making cheese,
right.
But also fermenting meat products. I mean, we eat a lot of fermented meat.
Right.
When you're eating sausages and cured meats of various kinds, there's a bacteriological transformation that's gone on. And then alcohol, which is also the product of fermentation. And I talk about making beer and
right.
a little bit about wine and things like that. These are kind of the most amazing transformations of all because they're done without heat. And they're done by manipulating other creatures.
Well, but also it's the other three are these kind of like heroic almost sort of elements,
where we can pretend
we can pretend there. Yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
This one, it feels like, this is the downhill slide into, something going bad.
Rot.
Right, rot.
Well,
right. This is the on
well
way to
managed,
putrid.
Right.
Right, right.
It's rot interrupted. It's well-managed rot. And it's true. And basically what happens to... The amazing thing is, sauerkraut. I don't know whether you like sauerkraut. Maybe you like kimchi better. And I like making kimchi better than sauerkraut. It's a little easier.
What's the difference in terms of the, the physics?
The sauerkraut is cabbage, salt, you're done. Basically, if you shred cabbage, salt it, put it in a crock, you don't have to inoculate it. It's just amazing. These microbes, lactobacillus, are on the leaves of the cabbage. They're on your hands. They're probably in the crock, and they go to work digesting this food, which is to say rotting. Everything that lives is colonized by a bunch of microbes waiting for it to die. or a cut, that torn leaf, and get in and get to work. They're waiting for you right now. And
their virtues have just yet to be discovered, I believe. Right, yeah.
That was the first miracle.
Right.
The only ingredient in sauerkraut is salt.
Mm-hmm.
Kimchi, you use a different kind. You can use that kind of normal round cabbage, but traditionally use Napa cabbage, and you add a lot of spices. You add ginger and garlic and red pepper, and it's got so many strong spices that you can control the fermentation a little more easily. You don't get molds, which can make a sauerkraut. If you've ever had mushy sauerkraut, it's because these yeasts that or molds put down these filaments, and destroy the pectin and make it mushy, and that happened to me. Kimchi, that doesn't seem to happen because of all the garlic and ginger. But it's made the same way. You salt it and cut it up and cut it roughly, so there's a lot of surface area for the microbes to work on. You don't want a really sharp knife, oddly enough. And then it just happens. And you put it in this crock, and 48 hours after you do it, it starts burbling. And it's just going to work.
See, I understand how we stumbled into making bread or fire, whenever, or putting meat on fire, but how did we stumble into this? Or is there any sense of when we figured out how to do this?
No, but we've been fermenting food for a very long time. You need some crockery, although actually you don't, because the first ferments were in the earth. You would just dig a hole, and I saw this in China. Actually, I was in China last year, and when you have excess cabbages, you dig a deep hole and you bury them and cover it, and they will ferment.
Right. Haggis, I think, the original recipe of haggis, you bury the stomach filled with all sorts of internal organs on the heath. And dig it up 3 weeks later. Right?
Burying things is a way, and that's one of the reasons I also call this section Earth, is a primitive form of fermentation. And they found these taro pits, hundreds of years old, that are still I mean, edible, using the word loosely, this mush that you can eat and is very nutritious, but it's really old.
Right.
And in Iceland, they bury shark. Their great, I forget the name of it, but it's their great delicacy that they insist that guests try. And I had to try it recently. And the reason they bury this particular shark is sharks don't have kidneys, so all the urea just kind of bleeds into their muscle. So
Tasty. Yeah.
they're not edible. They're not edible until they've been fermented, and the fermentation breaks down the urea, and it's not wonderful when it's all done. It's like a really strong scent of ammonia, and it's cheesy in consistency. And they claim to like it, and they oh, don't you want to try Hakkurl? It's called, I think. But I noticed that every bite is followed by a shot of schnapps. That doesn't say to me that
Haggis is eaten that way also.
That doesn't tell me people are savoring it. But one of the things, every culture has a disgusting food.
Well, I was going to say, so the stinky. I mean, we like the stinky cheese.
We Asians don't.
Right, Asians don't
You show
traditionally
them
like
a wash
Western
rind
cheese.
Yeah, you show them a wash rind cheese, and Asians will, in China, will just run for the hills. I mean, they just think it's so gross. Yet, they love stinky tofu, which is really nasty. And you basically, I'm not Asian. You take a block of tofu, and then you rot some vegetables, a mix of vegetables, and just let them rot, not ferment, rot. I mean, yes, they're fermenting, but till it's black and viscous, and then you just submerge the tofu in that for weeks at a time, and you take it out and you fry it, or you don't fry it, and you eat it. And the smell is just pure garbage. I mean, literally, it smells like garbage, and they love it. And they say that it's got a clean taste compared to cheese.
Right.
Because cheese has got a lot of fat, so the taste lingers in your mouth, which
Right.
we like and they hate.
Right.
So I think it's very interesting that, one of the things culture is drawing lines around your group. And a disgusting food is a good way to draw lines around your group. We are the people who eat this.
Right.
And you're not, and you don't like it. And
Right.
it's the kosher root also, the kosher
Right.
law.
We'll get to the stinky in a minute. I'm also just interested in sort of what happens when you eat. Why do we eat pickled foods? Why do we eat fermented things? In other words, I understand that when you cook meat over a fire, it breaks down, the proteins and whatnot, or it allows you to get all the nutrients out of the meat much easier.
Yeah.
Right? And same with cooking on a stovetop and so on. But what are we getting out of eating microbial food?
Well, we're getting a few things. One is that the fermentation process itself makes the food, it partially digests the food, so you use less of your own energy. And this is true with all different kinds of cooking. You use less of your own energy to break down the food. The microbes have started the process.
Right.
It's partly cooked, partly digested. The other thing that the microbes are doing, though, is creating nutrients. They are actually producing vitamins of various kinds. B12 is a vitamin that we can't you get from fermentation or from animal flesh. So you get B12 from it, and a range of other nutrients, plus the acids that are produced, the lactic acid or the acetic acid, depending on the ferment, are very important nutrients. So you're eating these microbes that have produced other food, and that's really healthy. And then there is some evidence that the microbes themselves have an effect on your internal microbiota, it's called, the community that lives in your gut. Some of the bacteria that ferment food, Lactobacillus plantarum is the kind of climax species of a vegetable ferment. After it's gone on, there's tons of plantarum.
Right.
And plantarum is an important bacteria that seems to contribute to the health of the gut lining and do some very good things for us. So
you mentioned this little kingdom inside of us. Let's just go right for the gross right now, huh? I mean, so describe that little kingdom. How big is it? What does it look like?
It doesn't look like much. And I think that actually it's one of the reasons that's kept us from understanding it. I mean, it looks like shit. I had an experience when I was doing the research for this book, I went to Iowa State, and an animal scientist brought me to meet this fistulated cow. This is a cow that has a hatch surgically implanted in its flank. And they can open and close it and watch its digestion in real time. And the scientist, he opened it up, and this is the rumen where the hay is being digested, or the grass. Mm-hmm. And it's just this bolus of hay and stuff, and it smelled, pretty nasty. And he said, "Reach your hand right in." Oh. And I reached my hand in to the rumen, and it was warm and lots of partially digested hay. And, the idea that what I was seeing was actually a very sophisticated ecological system, a community, with an order and a structure, such that there were certain kinds of microbes around the edges and certain kinds of ones in the middle, and that some microbes were feeding other microbes, and some microbes were producing chemicals that were influencing the cow's appetite and mood, was just impossible to credit to look at this. But we're discovering that is indeed what's going on down there.
How many, do we have a sense of the
We have about a
scale?
kilo of bacteria in your stomach.
Wow.
I've read from 1 pound to a kilo. And
how many species?
About 100 species. We thought for a while it was a couple hundred, but now it looks like it's about 100 species. And they're different in all of us.
Right.
And your diet.
So when
has
we're eating things like sauerkraut, are we feeding that ecosystem in some way? Are we keeping it, maintaining it? Is it a health
we're
issue
giving
there,
it a good food source. I mean,
Right.
The problem is, one of the problems with the Western diet that we're learning is that you need to feed these microbes, and they like slightly different food than you like. So, for example, we really like sugar, sweetness, refined flour and things like that. We like these easily digested or absorbed things. They like plants, and they like fiber. And we don't have, generally when we process food, we're removing fiber from it in one way or another. So we've been starving the microbiota for a while in the West, which has only recently been appreciated.
Is my microbiota different from, say, my mother's? In terms of, has my diet changed that kingdom in some way?
Well, that's not totally understood. The initial kind of seeding of your microbiota comes from your mother at birth.
Right.
If you're born by cesarean, it comes differently. And in fact, that may explain why children born by cesarean have higher rates of allergies and their immune systems don't develop quite as well. But that initial seeding of the microbiota happens then, and then it happens from the environment.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, your microbiota will look a little like your father's too, a year or two out. It looks very different while you're nursing. And one of the really interesting wake-up calls we had to the importance of this is when we tried to understand milk. Mother's milk is, when you think about it, it's the only food, and I use the word designed advisedly, designed by natural selection, right? I mean, it was meant to be food, and so there presumably is nothing in it that doesn't have a very good purpose, okay? Otherwise, natural selection would discard it, because milk comes at a huge metabolic cost to the mother. I mean, mothers will literally dissolve their flesh to make milk, even when they're malnourished. So one of the things we didn't understand was that milk is full of a complex sugar, an oligosaccharide it's called, that babies can't digest. They don't have enzymes for it. So it passes through the small intestine unused. And there are more of these oligosaccharides than there are protein in mother's milk. This made no sense until they figured out that the bacteria love these oligosaccharides. And one bacteria in particular, Bifida infantis, which you'll see on the side of some yogurts. It's a probiotic. And so that mother's milk is designed to guide the development of the microbiota down a very specific path, because this is a very useful bacteria. It does a lot of good. And it keeps other bad bacteria from getting a toehold. So that's a real, I think we have to study that example, because basically it's telling you that a well-designed food, a perfectly designed food, should be feeding not just us, but the 100 trillion also.
Right.
And we need to design our food so it does the same thing.
I feel like when I hear a word like microbiota, I sense this slide into like some serious American quackery out there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but I realize that somebody's going to be selling me something that it's going to sound good, and
Well, probiotics.
and the metaphor that there's a trillion of these in us, and we have to feed this ecosystem in order to keep ourselves healthy, totally makes sense. But it also totally makes sense for an infomercial,
Right.
So, can you give me any sense of where like the science ends and the
Quackery
nonsense?
begins?
Yeah, the quackery begins.
Yeah, probiotics is probably a good place to draw the line. I mean, probiotics are good bacteria that are sold in pill form, and that there are some real questions. There's some interesting research that suggests that some of them do things, that they're very helpful, but they don't take up residency. You don't find them after you've eaten them. They don't seem to survive in general. Nevertheless, some of them seem to have an effect on what's going on, but they're being oversold. They're definitely being oversold. And the numbers you get when you take a probiotic supplement are so small compared to eating something like sauerkraut, say, where you're getting billions and billions of little bugs. So that I think that there is quackery around probiotics. There's something there, and we will design really good ones eventually, but we haven't done it yet. It's not to dismiss them all out of hand. I mean, there are cases where they've been shown to work, but they're definitely being oversold.
Let's go back to the stinky for a second. So,
I didn't know we'd left it.
well, yeah, we were just deep in the stinky. Now I want to go back to the surface of the stinky, like actually eating cheese and eating things like kimchi. And I mean, so you sort of referenced that one's love of stinky does seem to be either culturally derived or geographically derived or something, right? I mean, does every culture on the planet have this sort of cascade of stinky foods and leading all the way down to like Limburger cheese or whatever?
Yeah. I don't know that every culture has them. Every culture has had its fermented foods. That's a universal, and that's very interesting. And it makes sense because before refrigeration, that was a very good way to preserve food, was to ferment.
Right.
It lasts a really long time. And so we, as a species, have been eating lots of Lactobacillus plantarum for millions of years, and it may well be an important constituent of the human diet, or should be. I went to a kimchi museum in Seoul, one of two in Seoul, which are two of 6 in the country. They're really serious about their kimchi. And I went in there, and there were these dioramas.
Are there not cheese museums in France?
What?
Are there not cheese museums in France? Of course,
yeah, there are.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So I know it seems funny to us. It's very serious to them. And there are dioramas of women rubbing spice into leaves and beautiful crocks. They bury these crocks outside for the kimchi and different kinds of peppers. And there were like one group of kindergartners after another was filing through, and they wear these great little yellow uniforms, and they all have these yellow backpacks. And I asked the docent, I said, why are you bringing children here and to the kimchi museum? And she said, totally straight face, children are not born liking kimchi. It's part of socialization. And there's certain foods we're socialized into, and some of these more exotic flavors you need to be socialized into. It's not like sugar where we have an innate.
Right. I was going to say, you think of all the vocabulary we have to describe our foods, right? Or just think of even the more sort of like Baroque language for describing wine.
Yeah.
Right? It's all floral this and
right.
hints of nutmeg and whatnot, but cheese.
Well, pied de deux.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, a stinky French cheese is pied de deux, the feet of God, which is to say, the stinky feet of God. I mean that it's a very interesting phrase, and especially interesting when you learn a little bit about the microbiology. And it turns out that the bacteria that makes a washed rind, there's a interesting euphemism, cheese smelly, is very closely related to it's Brevibacterium that lives in your armpits and elsewhere on your body and gives humans their scent. And that
So what are we smelling when we smell cheese?
body odor. cheesemakers don't like to say this, but you're smelling the human body. I mean, it's not necessarily body odor, but these are animal smells, and that they go really deep. I mean, our sense of smell is really underemployed, I think, in our society. And stinky cheeses, I found this, I wrote about this nun, Sister Noella, who makes a Connecticut at a cheese that you probably could find, maybe even around here, I don't know, or at the Abbey in Bethlehem, Connecticut. And she makes a washed rind cheese, a Saint-Nectaire, or a Connecticut version of a Saint-Nectaire. And one of the few cheesemakers who was willing to talk to me about the erotics of disgust, as only a nun can do. And, and it was a very interesting conversation. But I realized if you're in the food business, you're not going to want to talk about disgust very much. It's not the way to sell food. But she was really into it. And then she put me on to a philosopher cheesemaker in Paris named James Stillwagon, and told me about him. And he's kind of a connoisseur of this. And he's written some extraordinary descriptions of cheeses and about how, we don't have a vocabulary like wine, that's floral and earthy and metallic and all this kind of stuff. Because if we did, it would be very uncomfortable with cheese. So we just say it's powerful, delicious. I mean, I think we're repressing the vocabulary of cheese. And this guy, James Stillwagon, who has a website, or had a website, it seems to have been taken down.
I'm getting a sense he's not repressed.
He is so not repressed. He's so extravagant in the way, but I quote him in the book in some length. I really enjoyed his website. It's called Sex, Death, and Cheese.
And they're all the same, essentially.
And for him, they're all on a continuum, yeah. So anyway, cheese is a very interesting thing. Now, you talk about how we discover these things. Right. I mean, cheese was probably discovered when some herder opened up the rumen of one of its ruminants, of an animal, of a goat or a cow, and discovered that, of a baby, and discovered that there were these clumps of milk in there. Because what happens is, when a baby drinks milk, the baby turns it into cheese in its gut, in its stomach. And we have acids that do this. And in fact, this is still how we make cheese. Rennet is from the lining of the first stomach of a ruminant. And it rearranges the proteins in a way that they form this gel. And that is superior for the baby's digestion. Not totally understood why, but it slows the absorption of the food and rearranges the proteins in a good way. So probably we found cheese. We didn't invent it and then figured out ways to make it. Or it may have been someone who just used a stomach as a carrying device for liquids and put milk in it. And lo and behold, it turned into cheese. And the advantage of the cheese was, of course, it stayed fresh longer because it had these acids in it. So it didn't go bad. It went bad in a good way.
So we don't have a very good vocabulary for cheese, but one of the things you write about in the book is that we almost have a kind of a surplus of vocabulary for roasting whole animals outdoor. The barbecue universe seems to have engendered, I think, what you call it, BBQ Blarney.
Yeah.
Right. This enormous amount of nonsense that comes out of the mouths of these pit masters. I don't know where you get that.
I learned a lot of this from this pitmaster right here.
So what do you mean by barbecue Blarney? What is that? And why do we talk about roasted animals differently than say, cheese? Right.
Well, there's a lot of self-flattery that goes on in the barbecue world. And I found these guys are just some of the greatest bullshitters in the world. And Jack comes out of this culture, actually, and is himself a very good pitmaster. And
is that a euphemism or something?
He sensitized me to this, and these very fine distinctions. There's so many ways to do barbecue. You can do ribs, you can do sausage, you can do whole hog, you can do shoulders, and every region of the South claims that it has the keys to the kingdom of barbecue and that there's no other way to make it. And so if you're with someone in eastern North Carolina doing whole hog barbecue, and that's what I studied, so-called, you'll talk about, well, what about the barbecue over in Lexington, where they do shoulders? And say, well, that's a food, but it's not barbecue. and then what about Texas? Yeah, that, okay, but it's not barbecue. And and there are these maps. You turned me on to a map of the Carolinas, and it's the barbecue Balkans, and there's a line, and people know exactly where the sauce goes from tomato-based to yellow mustard-based, and there's a lot of tension along those lines, and drawing lines around acceptable and non-acceptable food is a big human preoccupation, and the Southern pitmasters are very good at it. So I decided that barbecue is kosher laws for goys, basically, and that it gives you all the pleasures of saying this is kosher, this isn't kosher, with pork.
Right. Well, so
which is great.
Since you've hung out with so many pitmasters, who is more rabbinical in their distinctions, redneck barbecuers or rabbis?
I would say the redneck barbecuers. Yeah, because the rabbis are actually remarkably flexible. I make an exception for bacon. I mean, you run into this, observant Jews who will eat certain things that aren't. My mother-in-law, for example, I remember when my brother-in-law was dating someone since married who wasn't Jewish and went out to dinner with my mother-in-law who keeps kosher. At home, and she's asking carefully, like, well, does that pasta, it was Italian rice, does that have any pork in it, any bacon, any pancetta? And he said, well, I'll check. And he said, well, if it does, I'll have the shrimp. And Martha is like, huh? How does this work exactly? So anyway, the pitmasters are definitely more rigid about all this.
I know.
But let me just add one thing. The reason, though, I realize that they've dressed this up and fetishized sauce and the kind of wood you use and the kind of heat you use is that it's really simple.
Right.
It's just time and heat and meat, and you can't screw it up. And so there's been a real effort, I think, to overcomplicate barbecue. That it's like grilling. It's like men grilling. You could never figure this out.
I think there's a whole genre of those foods, right? I mean, I grew up with fried chicken too, and everybody, God, get into a fried chicken conversation. It's almost, like barbecue. So I know, like me, you collect savannas of Africa metaphors. I do. From the time I was a kid, somebody is always coming forward with a new savannas of Africa theory. It's, when did we become human? Was it when we stood upright? Was it when we, learned how to throw a spear of some kind? Funeral rituals, genital display. One of those many, many things suddenly made us human, right? And in your book, you elaborate on the Harvard guys,
Richard Wrangham,
whose argument is that when we learned to cook and learned and shortened the amount of time we spent eating, we opened up this whole new moment for culture and growing our brains and so on. So, give me the Michael Pollan 2-minute history of mankind. Go all the way Homo erectus and bring me to the microwave. What's that narrative?
Well, the cooking hypothesis.
We only have a few more minutes.
Yeah, right. Okay. The cooking hypothesis. We're going to have time for questions?
Yeah. I want to save some time
maybe after
for
this.
Yeah, so this will be our last.
Was put forward by an anthropologist and primatologist named Richard Wrangham at Harvard, and he's trying to answer this mystery of evolution, which is at a certain point the human brain gets, or the proto-human brain gets really large, and the gut gets relatively small compared to primates of our size. Right. And it was often thought it was meat eating that gave us this additional, caloric bonanza that allowed us to grow these big brains and all these other things flow from that. But raw meat is very hard to digest, actually, and you do need a lot of gut to do that, and a lot of chewing. And so his hypothesis that it was when we discovered how to control fire and cook meat and other things over fire that we became human. And the reason is that once you cook things, they're much more nutritious. You use less of your own energy to digest them. They're partially broken down. And so what it gave our species was, and also it detoxifies certain foods. So for instance, tubers, which are often poisonous, eaten raw, potatoes and cassava and things like that, if you cook them, you can eat them. So think about that. It gives us access to a source of calories no other animal has. It's an enormous boon to our species. And when we started eating cooked food, he hypothesizes, and it's hard to prove, our brains got bigger because we had all these extra calories, and our guts shrank, and we could reapportion that. And if you look at primates our size, they have very long, digestive systems, and they spend about 6 hours a day in the mere act of chewing. Now, you're not going to have art and culture and opera if you're spending 6 hours a day chewing. I'm racing ahead now.
That explains a lot about my home state. But anyway.
So chimps, for example, hunt, as it turns out, and like to eat meat, but they only have 18 minutes in which to do everything besides gathering their food and chewing it.
Oh, so they're stressed out, middle-brow workers also.
So anyway, it should be called the chewing hypothesis.
Right.
Anyway, it was a really important development. It's funny, we kind of sense this too. I mean, James Boswell said in the 1800s, I guess, that we were the cooking creature. Mm-hmm. And Claude Lévi-Strauss, pointed out that moving from the raw to the cooked is the creation of culture. It's where we bring our intentionality, our traditions, to this raw stuff of nature. Turns out there are some animals who ferment by burying things and things like that. But basically, we are the cooking.
And some chimps scavenge in burnt forests, right? I mean, there are
that's interesting.
Evidence of.
You could see why we'd be predisposed to cook food.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of animals that when a forest fire comes through, they go through and they really like the roasted, chipmunk and or certain nuts that have been cooked. That
Toasted,
a lot of creatures will go into a burnt forest
Right.
and they really like that kind of barbecue.
Okay, one last mega question, and then we're going to turn to the audience. But in the narrative of your book, you talk about the 20th century processing foods, and then of course we're now transitioning into this different era of processing entire meals, right?
Yeah. Ultra processed food, it's called.
Ultra processed food, right? So, what's the trajectory do you see? I mean, is there a way back for us to start cooking again, or is there a new sort of forward where we, don't lose what we have, or is there some way out of this kind of processed, disease-ridden, non-cooking world that we've seemed to have created for ourselves?
Well, I think there are two paths open to us. One is that the food industry is optimistic that they can design healthier and healthier foods that solve a lot of our problems. I'm really skeptical that they can do this for reasons having to do with their business model, for reasons having to do with the fact that if you think about the history of food technology, we have this glorious history of cooking, which has made food more nutritious, easier to digest, given us new nutrients, all this kind of stuff that goes on from this discovery of fire all the way to, I would date 1880 or so, when we figured out how to refine white flour. From that time forward, our processing of food has made it less healthy. It's a really interesting turn in human history that we almost got too smart for our own good, and we figured out ways to process food that made it superficially attractive, but in fact, for our health, really bad. I don't know if I can point to an example of food processing since 1880 that has really been a net gain to public health. And frozen vegetables, yes. Canning vegetables, yeah. These are net gains, but I think they come around that same period. So I think we're not going to get out of this box, which is to say the chronic disease that's becoming so epidemic in our culture, unless we rebuild a culture of cooking. It's not going to be the same culture of cooking because it's going to have to be shared. It can't be a female culture of cooking. I think the challenge is going to be to get our children into the kitchen, to teach cooking again in schools, again, not gendered as home ec was, but to everyone. And get people to realize that what seems like drudgery is really the most wondrous alchemy, and that there is pleasure to be had and interest to be had in this work, and that we have to change our perception of it. And that's what I hope this book does. This book is not a lecture or an argument. It's really just a discovery of these miracles available to us, this power to make alcohol. What an amazing thing that you can, at home, make this substance that will change your experience of reality. That's great. That's great stuff. And that we've deprived ourselves of some interest and pleasure by letting other people do this for us, and that we need to reclaim this. So that's my hope, and I'm, hopelessly optimistic, as you know. But that's what I'd like to see. And there's some encouraging evidence. The decline I described since 1965, since 2008, home cooking has come up a little bit. It may just be a product of the economy, because cooking is economical. We forget, but maybe it's the sign of a change.
Fantastic. Can we open this up to questions? We only have a few more minutes to be here. But does anyone want to approach these microphones right over here and ask a question?
Not everybody at once, please.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Gouch. My artist name is Molasses Jones. And every time I tell somebody my artist name is Molasses, they have a huge smile. However, when alternative sweeteners are publicized, little is molasses ever mentioned among them. And so I was hoping you could talk about the politics of sugar and sweeteners, because they're naturally appealing to us as human beings. So that's pretty much it, and thank you for talking, sharing, and all of that.
Thank you,
Great.
Molasses.
Okay.
It's a great name. Well, molasses is as I'm sure you know, is unrefined sugar. I mean, it's sugar brought to a certain point of refinement and not filtered to become, white. And molasses actually still has some nutrients that are bleached out of sugar along the way. Sugar is an amazing topic, and it is one of the very few tastes that we are hardwired to like. And the reason for that is probably because in nature, sugar was rare and a rich source of calories. And we evolved under conditions of scarcity. And that when you found sugar, you probably found fruit. And so with that sugar came this wonderful package of vitamin C and other antioxidants and fiber. Or you found honey, which was rare and wonderful, and a lot of effort went into securing honey. But it's only in the last couple hundred years that we figured out a way to rip sugar out of the context of healthy plant foods, and that's why it's become such a problem. One of the mysteries of artificial sweeteners that you were alluding to is that they don't seem to make a difference in people's weight. When people switch from natural sugars to artificial, you would think that since they're getting less calories, they should lose weight, and they don't seem to. And it may have something to do with the way that sugar primes the body to expect sugar, and it will find sugar somehow, and it will find it other places, if not in that soda. And I think that's probably the full extent of my knowledge of sugar.
Can you describe the Harry Balzer's diet, which is mentioned in the book, which may be the best diet I've ever heard in my life?
Yeah. Well, I was talking to Harry Balzer, this marketing consultant, and I'm saying, we're talking about the obesity epidemic, and he acknowledges it's coming from eating all this processed food. And I asked him at some point, all right, you're very cynical. You think cooking's over. It's dead. We're cheap and lazy. It's never going to happen again. But can you imagine a change and a way out of the obesity epidemic. And he said, you want to know a diet that works? This is a guy who's inside the food industry. You want to know the one diet that works? It's really simple. Eat anything you want as long as you cook it yourself. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. Because if you're cooking, you're not going to have French fries twice a day. Too much work. Too messy. You're not going to have dessert every night. Too much work. You're going to make kind of basic, good, healthy food, and you're not going to have to think about nutrients. So, keep that in mind. I mean, I think it was a real bit of wisdom from deep inside the belly of the beast.
Love it. Sir, you have a question?
Yeah, this is another request for a 2-minute history. You mentioned all these cooking processes that have to do with chemistry and microbes, but we didn't know about any of these things for the last 200 years. So for the hundreds of thousands of years before that, people must have thought of these transformations in different
Yes.
ways. So could you briefly describe?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's what's kind of amazing, that science has come late to the party here in terms of figuring out what's going on when you're making beer or cheese. Well, Sister Noella, who I was talking about, she makes her cheese in wooden barrels with a wooden stirring stick. And these sticks that were used to mix your cheese were considered magical. And they're brewing sticks also. And that you use this and suddenly you got your fermentation going. And people didn't know why, but of course it was microbes hiding in the grooves of that wood. Interesting, health department freaks out when they see someone trying to make cheese with wood, because you can't sterilize wood, or it's very, very difficult to sterilize it. And Sister Noella was under a lot of pressure to give up her wooden barrel, which is how it's made. This cheese is made in the Auvergne, and to go to stainless steel. And she actually went back to school and got a degree in microbiology so she could defend this method. And she set up this really interesting experiment where she took a batch of milk, divided it between the wooden barrel and a stainless steel vessel of some kind, and she deliberately inoculated them both with E. coli. And she watched what happened. And at the end of 4 hours or 6 hours, whatever it was, the stainless steel vat of milk had astronomic levels of E. coli. And the wooden one had microscopic, I mean really, really tiny, no health problem levels of E. coli. And the reason was that the wooden barrel had these lactobacillus that acidified the environment and killed the E. coli. So you see, she was using, without knowing it, and people in the Auvergne have known this, have done the same thing without knowing it. She was using one microbe to combat another, and the wood vessel was key. And so, arguably, people have been practicing what I call a kind of folk microbiology, which involved a lot of trial and error and probably dead people along the way. But nevertheless, works.
Yeah, I was just to point out, in your book, you note that the ancient word for cook, or the Greek word for cook, priest, and butcher are all the same.
And they're all related to magic.
Right.
Heroes.
Yeah, Magirus. So maybe the three magi were actually chefs coming with like pots of sauce,
Casseroles.
So, yeah, casseroles, right. Fermented pickle, I believe. So, yes,
Yes, I was wondering, so I've heard it said from the raw vegan movement that our body actually rejects cooked food in a way that's similar to, getting an outside, like a cold or something. Your body rejects it and it takes more time to process. Have you heard about that kind of, the argument against cooking food or?
Well, I've heard arguments against cooking food. I'd never heard the argument that it is essentially an allergen or, is going to provoke a reaction. And I'm really skeptical of that theory. I don't understand biologically why that would be. Vegans are, people who go on vegan diets often get remarkable health benefits from it. Some don't. Some have a lot of trouble with it and they suffer from deficiencies of B12, for example. But raw food we have a lot of research that people don't do very well long term, humans, on raw food. And that women who go on an all raw food diet more often than not stop menstruating. And that it's very hard to get enough nutrients from raw food because you need such a quantity of it since there's so much water in the diet. And it's very curious, people on a raw food diet, look how dependent they are on their blenders. That's how they deal with the 6-hour chewing problem,
Right.
is the blender.
And just to add to that, I mean, since we offshored a lot of our digestive tract to the pot on the stove, which is your argument, right? I mean, have we done enough of that we can't go back?
Well, having some raw food in the diet is probably a very good thing because the food that isn't broken down easily is what feeds your microbiota. So there is a place for raw food in the diet. I think there's not a place for all raw food.
Right.
And I think, and that's my take on like all forms of nutritional extremism. We're omnivores. We can eat a lot of things. It doesn't oblige us to eat anything, but that radical solutions to how to feed yourself, I'm just generally skeptical of. So yeah, some raw food for sure. I have friends who are vegans and have remarkable health and lose lots of weight. And then I have others who, I can think of one right now who's suffering with some neurological difficulties because he had a B12 deficiency. So,
Question over here.
Hi. I also have a sugar question.
Didn't I say it was the limits of my knowledge on sugar? Okay.
It has to do with fructose, which is something that I used to hear a lot about in terms of maybe it's just the same as glucose. It has the same number of calories per gram, et cetera. But now I'm hearing about all these links between fructose and the gut microbiota and how it's not exactly the same. And I was wondering if anything in your course of study has illuminated anything about fructose.
Yeah, well, fructose is a kind of sugar that appears to be more problematic in terms of our metabolism. It is metabolized differently. It's metabolized in the liver. And it has been, high levels of fructose in the diet has been correlated with type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome. I'm not sure exactly about what it does in the gut, though. I haven't read much about that because these things tend to be absorbed, before it gets to the colon. But there are several scientists who are particularly concerned about fructose. And the amount of fructose in our diet has gone up a lot. Fructose is normally, the fruit sugar, and it wasn't a huge part of the diet. But with processed food and high fructose corn syrup, which actually isn't so high in fructose, it's a little higher than normal sugar. But there are other forms of fructose now in the diet. Crystalline fructose. A lot of energy drinks have high fructose levels. Robert Lustig has written a lot on this. That would be a good place. He's got an interesting new book out, and he looks at fructose as a particular dietary evil. I tend to be skeptical of all efforts to brand single nutrients as the problem or the solution. It's usually more complicated than that, and we have this tendency in America to go nuts on a particular nutrient. And I'm waiting. I bet one of the 6 of you have a question about gluten.
Here we go.
All right.
We're gonna go to 1 o'clock, so you have 15 seconds for your question. Shoot.
Okay,
Let's go.
let me just jump to it then. Poor communities and particularly reservations lack access to healthy green food, and organic is too expensive, and the land natives were placed on currently are not technically good land to farm. So they've turned to cheap subsidized sources of food like fried flour. Do you see a cheaper alternative for healthy eating for these communities in the future?
Great question.
Yeah, really good question. We do have food deserts in this country, and it's turning out to be a little more complicated than that. There are places where people eat really badly, where they do have access to full-scale supermarkets, and the supermarkets are full of really bad food. So the Michelle Obama approach that we could just get a good supermarket, get Walmart into every neighborhood is going to fix things. It's not. I mean, you need to be able to afford the food. It's not just having the store there. And fresh produce costs more than processed food. If you have $1 to spend in the grocery store, and I've done this experiment with my students, and economists have done this experiment, and just say, get as many calories as you can for $1. The students will come back with chips and soda. They won't come back with broccoli or carrots. You can get much more in the form of processed food. So the challenge is, how do you make real food more affordable? And that's a complicated question. I mean, over the last 30 years, during the years of the obesity crisis, fresh produce has gone up in real dollars about 40%, while processed food, and soda in particular, has gone down about 7%. So the balance is getting even worse than it was. A couple things to think about. One is gardening. Gardening, which can be done in a great many places and does not involve a great expense or of money or labor, produces the healthiest, most seasonal, most freshest, most nutritious food you can possibly have. And we're finding lots of underserved communities where community gardening and individual gardening has enjoyed a renaissance. And that was one of the most positive things Michelle Obama did, was plant a garden at the White House and get people, rates of home gardening went up dramatically. So I think underserved communities have to take seriously the idea of growing their own food and learning how to do it. And so I think that holds real possibilities. Ultimately, we're going to have to adjust all the incentives in the food system. I mean, right now we subsidize the least healthy calories in the supermarket with our agricultural subsidies. That's how they're organized. We don't subsidize produce. We subsidize corn and soy, which are the building blocks of processed food. So we're going to have to address it at that level. We're going to have to create incentives for farmers to diversify and grow a lot more vegetables. But I think in the short term, when you have an emergency, growing food is a very important way to go.
Thank you.
Thanks
Great.
for your good question.
Over here, your question. 15 seconds.
Hi. A question for you, Michael Pollan, although if you have something to add, that would be great too as a reporter. Less about food and more about your work. You're a writer and a researcher. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how you go about doing your work, how you go about your writing and your research. And, you know, for example, with kimchi, you can go to a museum, you can read articles or books, you can find a recipe and try it yourself, but presumably you have to talk to people about it, maybe even go into their kitchen and watch them make kimchi the way we like to watch people make food.
Well, let's talk about kimchi. I mean, I'll try to narrow your question because we don't have a lot of time. I mean, I wanted to learn about kimchi, and I always start with books. I buy books. I read Sandra Katz's book, Wild Fermentation. And I read other recipes, and I started reading history. And then I started finding, oh, wow, there's a really great artisanal pickler in my community named Alex Hosven. And I went, and she has a store called Cultured, and she's at the farmer's market in Berkeley. And I went, and I said, could I work here for a day? Or 2 days, actually. I ended up working there. I just want to learn how you do it. And I'll work for free. And people are often very happy to have labor, especially in food work. And I learned an immense amount, pestering her with questions. And there's a way of learning that happens, when you're doing things that you can never get from a book. I mean, some people, can learn how to change a diaper from a diagram or something. I can't. I really need to have somebody show me. And that was definitely true for cooking, too. And so volunteering your services is a great way to learn how to do something. And then I went looking to understand the microbiology, and I discovered there was a group of food scientists at Davis University near me. And there was a woman there who studied vegetable ferments, and I started seeing her names on academic papers, and I called her up, and I said, could I come interview you? I want to learn about Lactobacillus plantarum. So you kind of follow this daisy chain of one person, and every interview you say, is there anyone else I should talk to? You know what I'm interested in now. Who else should I talk to? And one person leads you to another, and you're done when everybody starts repeating themselves.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
must be time to write now.
Yeah, it's a little like the scientific method. I find that like you read something and sort of theories begin to form in your head, and then you go out in the world and that's your experiment.
Right,
Right. And
that's
it
right.
disabuses you of many
It
things.
turns out to be a lot more
Turns out to
complicated.
be much more complicated. So that back and forth is really the
Yeah, the
essence of
doing
it.
and
Yeah.
the reading are in a really productive dialogue, and I think that's really important, because if you do it all from reading, weirdly enough, you get it wrong.
Sadly, you are the last question.
Cool. My name is Miranda, and I don't necessarily have a question, but I have an invitation. I go to a school in New Haven, and it's called Common Ground High School, and it is an urban farm and urban environmental education center. And last year, we read your book in my Food and the Environment class, where I learned about high fructose corn syrup and how meat is really grown, and corn and that kind of stuff. And when I saw this event on Facebook, and I was like, oh, I could come and invite him to my school, because my
So you do have a question. Will I come visit your school?
Yes, you should come to my school. It's a really cool place.
It is a really cool place.
See, everybody knows about Common Ground, but it's a farm, and there are chickens and goats and sheep and bunnies.
And the best compost pile.
And the best
in town.
compost pile
Totally.
ever. And it's a really cool place, and I was wondering if you could come and either just come and visit or just come and talk, because it's really interesting. And you were talking about education and like learning things like by doing, and that's what my school does. We learn about.
Sounds great.
It's a really cool place.
Well, I would love to come visit your school. I'm leaving town for a long time this afternoon, but I will find a time to come back. Because I come to visit Jack and come to Yale occasionally. So next trip, I would love to come. So you have to give me all your information.
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you for the
Thank you,
invitation.
everyone. Thank you, Michael Pollan.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you.